Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for March 7th, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brennan Cassidy.
Thanks for joining us, everybody, for Dune!
We have finally
Part
traveled
2.
to Arrakis.
We have finally been
We've
to
landed.
Arrakis.
We've landed, and the sandworms are trying to eat us.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting trying to figure out timing. We've been trying to set this up for what feels like forever now.
Oh yeah, this should have come out like 4 days ago.
But schedules being what they are, we're a little late to the party, but we're going to have it regardless.
Oh, we have to talk about it.
Yeah, we're going to talk about it. And I'm very excited. This was one of my most anticipated films of the year. We talked about it on the main show this last week, episode 575. The box office, the success of it in its opening weekend was very exciting.
It was very good.
There were memes galore. Everyone was talking about the Dune.
Those popcorn buckets. That's
The popcorn buckets.
That's what it is. Grassroots campaigns, man. That's what gets people in.
T-shirts that say, I'm just here to F the popcorn bucket.
Yep.
You know,
People riding around AMC lobbies on mechanical sandworms.
All of the above. Yeah. It was
I
very
love when
exciting.
movies, whether you like the movie or not, you have to love that it's turned into an event. Like
It
with
was an
Barbenheimer
event.
last year, I
Yep.
miss the eventful movies. I really do.
Yep. And Dune Part 2 certainly was an event. And there's absolutely no doubt that we are going to get Messiah here in, who knows, the next few years, a decade maybe. I don't know. It depends on how much they want to pander to the time gap in the novels.
I weirdly think Denis Villeneuve has got a bit of a blank check here. I think he's going to make some movies in between. I know he wants to, and he's got quite a few projects in between there. One being some secret project that some people are speculating is a James Bond film, and I really hope that's not the case. I mean, he'd be an interesting choice for it, but I'd like to see someone a little bit more surprising. But I weirdly think that Warner Brothers will allow Denis to follow the time jump between Dune and Dune Messiah and Frank Herbert's original novels, and it makes it interesting because it'll turn this trilogy into kind of the reverse of what we've seen other trilogies do. Like in the early 2000s, you'd have something like The Matrix, and then many years later they'll rush 2 movies to complete a trilogy in like the same year. They did the same thing with Pirates of the Caribbean, sort of the same thing with Back to the Future. Whereas this is kind of the reverse. It's like the first 2 are sandwiched together, then the third is its own later thing. Yeah. And I think that'll be interesting if they do that.
Well, it would be interesting. I do wonder, though, if Denis would take the same approach to Messiah as he did with Part 2, because as some of you may know, if you've read the novel, where Part 1 ended to where Part 2 begins, there actually is an escalation of time in the novel that Denis removes here.
He does, yeah.
We'll talk about it in the review, but Part 2 follows Part 1 pretty much immediately. So if he follows that same formula, Messiah, maybe he removes that time jump.
He might, but I weirdly hope not, because I think having a time jump here will do some really interesting things for where we left Paul Atreides in this movie. And we may have to talk about that specifically. We are a little late to the game on this one, GD. So maybe we should clarify, or at least throw it out there. This might be, in fact, it probably will be a spoiler-filled conversation. I think there's a lot we need to talk about now that the film has been out for a while. Maybe we'll give our opening thoughts, kind of start there, and then maybe teeter off into more specific territory that this movie travels in.
I like how in the digital age that we're in now, a while is exemplified as 6 days.
Isn't that ironic?
I mean, and you're not necessarily wrong. A lot of people have seen this movie already.
And to be honest, most of our listeners and watchers on YouTube as well have probably seen the movie already too.
Yeah,
that's given
also
where
true.
So we'll make a clear point where we're going in the spoilers, so we can at least cater to those who may not have seen the movie and just want to know, oh, did you guys like it or not? Like, just simple as that.
Yeah, and you know what's also interesting too, speaking of the digital age and how if you're not in the moment with everyone else, how
Yeah.
easily things can be spoiled for you because there were images, clips, gifs
Yeah.
of pretty significant moments in this film.
Yeah.
Somehow they landed on social media over the weekend, like as the
Yeah.
film is being released. I truly don't know how
How that gets
that happens.
well, there's less security and less regulation being able to block those things now. But I mean, thank God for the muting feature on Twitter, for instance. But the fact, like, you shouldn't have to do that every time a big movie comes out. Like
Mhm.
that's a problem that if it keeps on building on itself like that.
Yeah, it's pretty insane. But
Yeah.
either way, here we are.
Here
Dune
we are.
Part 2. I'm excited. Let's go ahead and jump into it. It
Yep.
is, of course, directed by the one and only Denis Villeneuve. It stars Timothée Chalamet, Zendaya, Rebecca Ferguson, Josh Brolin, Austin Butler, Florence Pugh, Dave Bautista, Christopher Walken, Leah Seydoux, Stellan Skarsgård, Javier Bardem, of course. And the list goes on and on. Charlotte
Yeah.
Rampling is back
Yep.
here once again as well. If you're not familiar with Dune Part 2, to Brendan's point, maybe you're not listening, but just in case, Paul Atreides unites with Shani and the Freeman while seeking revenge against the conspirators who destroyed his family.
Nice
Okay.
animation there, JD.
Appreciate it.
Nicely performed. You're channeling your inner Austin Butler for that one.
Absolutely. I should have shaved my head and
Don't
painted
do that.
myself
Don't do
a
that.
little ghostly for this. What did you think about Dune Part 2?
It's good. Thankfully, it's good. It's great when event movies like this are actually good, right?
Mhm.
I think I do like it more than part one. And for context, I liked part one, but didn't love it because it really does feel like half a movie to me. And it really is that introduction to this world. But I did say when we first saw part one back in 2021 that what I see in part two could help recontextualize how I feel about part one. And maybe it'll make me like it more. And honestly, I did find more of an appreciation for part one because of part two, looking at it as that pure introduction. And to be perfectly
Mhm.
honest, I actually think part one is a better movie as far as narrative and flow is concerned. I do think part two has some issues in its storytelling beats. There are moments where I think, wait a minute, how did people get there? Did you like skip a scene or something like that? There is more of a choppiness to it when compared to part one. But I think the reason why I prefer it to part one is because it actually does arrive at a very natural and compelling conclusion.
Mhm.
It's the way the film sticks the landing uh, as to where I think it really succeeds. And we'll certainly talk about the film's climax, what it means. A lot of what we hypothesized about this film is pretty much what we got in pretty interesting ways. It's interesting that this movie is broken up into two parts because it basically is Lawrence of Arabia with the intermission. It's as if they released
Yeah,
both halves of Lawrence of Arabia in
as
three
separate
separate years.
movies.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
it kind of is like one half is the hero's journey, the other one is not really that, and
Maybe the opposite.
kind of the opposite. There's a lot of talk. I made the comparison
Yeah.
to Lawrence of Arabia. There's a lot of talk on how this movie, Dune in general, parts one and part two, and just the story in general, is very reminiscent of Star Wars and how Paul Atreides is like this mix of Luke and even Anakin in some ways. And they're even little things like even the Tusken Raiders, Arrakis mirroring Tatooine, the mining of spice. George Lucas even had the nerve to call that material spice in Star Wars as
You
well.
did. Yep.
I mean, I don't want to get into that. I just think it's really funny that's kind of going viral on Twitter as well. But like,
Mhm.
it just goes to show the influence of this story and the timeliness of it, and
Yeah.
or I guess timelessness of it is the best way to put it. And I do think Denis Villeneuve clearly has a conviction to tell this story in a way that maintains its roots. Like, it has a very traditional feel to it, despite the kind of dark, sinister, old-fashioned aesthetic to it. And as an experience, just seeing this in IMAX, which I did see this in IMAX, by the way, it's worth seeing just for the sound and the scope of it alone. Like that first film, I think this one maybe even has like a better achievement at that thrill, I guess. It's interesting. Like this movie features the sandworms a lot more, to the point that they could have gotten repetitive and like lost its luster as the film went on. But yet every time they come up, it's like a new surprise. Like somehow it feels like a new experience every time something similar just keeps happening. And that's credit to Denis Villeneuve as a filmmaker and how he's able to capture that. So a lot of things to love here. It's not my favorite Denis film. I prefer some of his others. But I think as a sheer spectacle and where it goes in the end, it's worth seeing. And I'm glad an event like this is actually good.
Yeah, as I've talked about many times before, I'm a big fan of Denis Villeneuve. I loved the first Dune. So, of course, this film was one of my most anticipated of the year.
Yeah.
And once again, it lived up to the hype for me.
Okay.
If Dune Part 1 was akin to something like Fellowship of the Ring, and I think that is actually the most apt comparison,
Okay.
I think this film is equally a fantastic Two Towers, especially from a transportive world building perspective. The visuals are lush, the effects are magnificent, the cinematography is utterly engrossing, continuing its dusty and arenaceous aesthetic with mesmerizing results, not to mention the inclusion of infrared cameras to depict the Harkonnen black sun, which added further texture to the film's visual allure here. Then there's the costuming and makeup, which is, of course, really great. It's a Denis film.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what else there is to say at this point. Visually, it is a feast. The one thing that arguably stands out the most, although we very much see this in Part 1 as well, but there's more of an emphasis on scope in Part 2. The sandworms are probably the most prominent example.
Oh, they're a
But
character
even-
in this movie now.
But even beyond that, the extreme wide shots in this film to exemplify the scale of this conflict and what's at stake is just extraordinary. And we get more of that in Part 2 than we did in Part 1, which makes sense as we're expanding far beyond the mining facilities seen in Part 1, and we're traversing large swaths of Arrakis, not to mention the home of the Freeman people. And I loved it. Absolutely loved all of that. The scope and scale of this film is grand. It is inviting. I don't know if I have the words to articulate the sound design as is in Part 1. It's incredibly engulfing, especially when coupled with Hans Zimmer's score, and his music is once again ridiculous. It is
That's
so
the beauty
good.
of IMAX. Sorry to cut you off, but like we often associate IMAX as a visual experience, but it's almost more auditory. Like that's almost the real reason to see IMAX movies nowadays.
I agree, and the sound design in this film is just absurd. It's just so so good. Yeah, say what you will about Denis, but his films are completely immersive, optically and auditorially, and this film is no different. As for the story here and its themes, many have noted this on social media and in their reviews, and I agree. It's not very subtle. We'll talk much more about that as this conversation goes. But I do love how brazen it is. I think the film does a great job of exhibiting the extremity of faith and how it is conflicting, especially in context of this particular narrative and the subversion that we see within Paul, given what we had seen in Part 1, as you noted, as the hero's journey. And in this, we're starting to see the seeds of the origin of the villain. We'll say vaguely. But I really like this. I really like this film a lot. I agree with you. It's not my favorite Denis film. That's still a rival, but I still quite love this movie.
Yeah, you're right that the film, thematically speaking, is pretty blunt. It is very direct in what it's going for. And if I did have another maybe slight knock on the film as well, like we do get a lot of people talking in this movie. A lot of people just conversing in kind of tight, composed areas. And compared to Part 1, I actually think Part 1 handled its script writing a little bit better. I felt like conversationally that film felt a little bit more natural, whereas there are times in Part 2 it sounds like characters are just spouting themes to us. And that is, it's not really a bad thing, primarily because at least the film's themes here on their face, regardless of how blunt they are, they're at least compelling. And that at least helps save it, because I do like how this film is essentially doing what we expected, kind of deconstructing the male white savior narrative. And that's what Frank Herbert was doing back in 1965 when he first released that first Dune. And that's kind of the timeliness of this story, in sort of looking at how our religious obsessions and fanaticism can be turned into a weapon. Governments like to do that. We see that nowadays too, how looking at religion as a form of weaponizing certain political beliefs, and trying to influence us through those means is a very universal thing, and it's kind of a scary thing. So this film is diving into that head on. So I appreciate that it has that conviction, even if it's not subtle. It's because like watching the compelling nature of those themes, I think is enough to maybe it's enough to ignore the almost literal form of dialogue here to spell those things out for us. And performatively, I think it works too. Like if these performances weren't very good, I'd probably be more critical of that. But there's at least conviction in these performances to sell whatever emotionality is going on here. And I think that's another good part here too.
Yeah, no, I think you make a lot of great points. I do love how that is handled in the first film, how that continues here. And while the film does, again, brazenly wear its ideas on its sleeves, I do think that Denis handles that diligently here. I don't think this film is also forcing it down your throat or trying to be some overt message movie.
No,
I think it's handled quite organically.
Yeah, they're different because there's still a few different interpretations you might be able to have here, as far as like what the character motivations have become because of this kind of puppeteering that we sort of learn about, right?
Yeah, like I think it's naturally infused into the world building, the lore, the mythology, the characters. That is front and center here. And I do love how Denis emphasizes that first and foremost. I talked about that quite a bit in our review of Dune a few years ago. That to me is what made the narrative of Paul so great in that film, despite it having this, at least in the context of iconography now, it seems like a derivative story, even if at the time the novel was written, it might have had a little bit more of a potency to it. But I still think it's handled really well in that film. And I think that continues into this film very well. And there's a simplicity to it. That's what I loved so much about part one as this coming of age narrative, Paul reckoning with the idea of him being the quote unquote chosen one, and how that invokes a series of visions he has throughout the film. I love that. I love the simplicity. I think it was effective because of that. However, there's a dichotomy in that film as well regarding the mirroring of destiny and reality, and how his powers begin to manifest as a result. But of course, for anyone in tune with the lore of Dune, all of that is a sleight of hand, because we know, as you were just alluding to there, Brendan, this is a story that is a cautionary tale for messianic worship and blind followership.
Yeah.
An idea that could have come off one note and abrasive if not handled properly. But what I love about this film is that most of its runtime is dedicated to subverting that dichotomy in Paul. He fights it relentlessly. He isn't shy about his feelings about the prophecy, despite the Stilgers of the world and their endless devotion. In fact, he becomes so consumed with shaking off his destiny that he becomes a rival to his own mother, who becomes wholly consumed with the prophecy and turning Paul into the Lisan el Gaib. There's so much mystery and foreshadowing in part one as it relates to Paul and who he's supposed to be, that this film tries to actively undermine and contradict, which I think adds needed complexity. It's not until the final act where things shift suddenly for Paul, after his hand is forced, so to speak, where his destiny and reality finally converge. And those moments I do think are electrifying. They're menacing, they're harrowing, yet Chalamet does give Paul this compelling charm that's weirdly alluring. So thematically speaking, I think there's a remarkable synergy between part one and part two that makes the storytelling here gripping.
Yeah, and it actually makes Paul a very fascinating character, watching him really try to fight off this pressure that is being put on him as the potential chosen one. And a lot of that irony is that, he picked, like, when he has to pick a Freeman name, he picks what Muad'Dib, I believe, is the name that he chooses, which is the name, the name of that small mouse, because he considers himself a very small mouse. He doesn't consider himself important. So then Javier Bardem has to tell him, no, that's actually a very powerful name, which sort of foreshadows you're actually a very powerful person. You don't even know it yet. So the more that Paul tries to shake off the pressure of being the chosen one, it leads to more anger and resentment and eventually revenge that he is almost forced to take it on anyway. And that's what I think is so interesting about the final act, is that shift in Paul. And I guess we're kind of getting closer to spoiler territory. I don't want to get too deep into this until we fully say, yes, we're getting into spoilers, but that shift in Paul is kind of sudden, which I think in any other movie that could be a problem, but here it's kind of fascinating because it leads to a lot of questions on his actual motivations and whether he's simply being driven by vengeance, if he's really just using this as a weapon, just like the puppeteers the council is really using as a weapon against him. Is it backfiring? Is this part of the plan? Is it like, I found that portion kind of interesting. So then it becomes this story of not just political figures using religion as a weapon against its people, but then how people use that same weapon to fight back. And that's where I think the film's ambiguity, if there is any, kind of lies. It's really like looking at the motivations of Paul and some of these other characters. I found that really fascinating too. At least that was my reading of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's understandable. And I'm not too dissimilar from you.
Okay.
And I do agree with you about the turn there with Paul. It could have been a little bit sudden. Admittedly, it didn't really bother me all that much. I do understand
I'm with you. Yeah,
some
I
of the
kinda like it.
reviews out there, why some are reserved, because Paul's shift into embracing the Lisan Gai moniker is kind of sudden.
Yeah.
Now, I do think all of the foreshadowing and character work is there in the screenplay and in Denis' direction to make sense of Paul's transition. But in the scene right before, there's an exchange between him and Shani where he is adamant that he is not going to change, that nothing will provoke him. And then literally in the next moment, he's drinking the blue juice without any resistance. The editing there is a little sloppy, to your point earlier.
Yeah.
Even if it all makes sense logically. So it doesn't quite have the sharpness in some of the transitions, primarily, I think, in the back half. A lot of the first half of the film, I think, is...
And there are times
really
when the
great.
Harkonnens just show up. It's like, wait a minute, how did you know they were there? It's like, it's just there to provoke conflict, because 5 minutes earlier, Paul said, I'm staying behind. Oh, nope, I'm going south now. It's like, there are little gaps there where it's almost like scenes were missing, it feels like.
Yeah. But I do think the marriage of the geopolitical maneuverings and politics that we saw in part one, that are very much carried over into this film, how that then bleeds into the religiosity that is imbued into this film, I think is really great and adds weight to the messianic ideas that is bubbling underneath throughout a lot of the film and then explodes in that final act and in that final 30 minutes or so. Like, I do think from a storytelling standpoint, even if it's a little choppy and getting us from one moment to the next, the character work, the foreshadowing is all there to make sense of it, even if the transition is a little weird. And thematically, I think there's cogency that, again, especially from a religious perspective, that I think is stimulating.
Well, I also wonder, that sudden shift in Paul that we're talking about, does it also work because Zendaya is just really good as Chani?
She is great.
Yeah,
really,
I mean,
great.
If there really is any character here that's a quote unquote victim, it's her. And given their relationship and how that, changes and turns and all that we're alluding to here. But like, her performance, I think, is what allows Paul's sudden shift to make even more sense, despite the potential choppiness that could exist in the editing, as you're talking about. And like I said, it still raises a lot of questions as to what Paul's motivations are, because when he makes that shift, when he's, drinking the blue juice, and first off, it's interesting how he's forced to drink that as if he's, kind of being puppeteered to become the chosen one, as opposed to really becoming the chosen one. Everything here is fabricated in a way. Yet,
Oh, yes.
yet it's also not, because there is an element of actual magic happening here. So that part is, practical in this world. So it's ironic that the religiosity is also practical, and yet the religion itself might not be real. Like, there's a lot of interesting things there that I really like. But that sudden shift in Paul, it makes you sort of question what his motivations are. If he's now wants, if this is something he's choosing to embrace because he wants it, or if he's using it as a vengeful tool. Because right before he drinks the blue juice, he learns a drop of new knowledge about his ancestry that sparks a completely new agenda out of him. And I found that really compelling, because it makes Paul sort of, not even sort of, it makes him very unreliable in a way where you don't even really know where he's going with all of this. And I found that compelling in and of itself.
Well, I completely agree. I think that's why Stilgar is so crucial to this film for me,
Mm-hmm.
because what he represents as it relates to fanatical faith,
Mm-hmm.
I think has a lot of influence on what you're talking about there with Paul. And
Yeah.
I think Bardem gives an incredible performance.
I think he might be the standout here.
He's really great because he rides this line between levity and sincerity that almost feels impossible to achieve.
I was thinking about that, because it's not just Javier Bardem, but when Josh Brolin shows up, like, the dynamic between the two of them is actually very funny. And
Yeah.
like, Denis Villeneuve is not someone that's really known for quote unquote comedy. None of his movies are comedies, but some of his movies have moments of levity for sure. Dune Part 2 is arguably his funniest movie yet.
And I think it is vital. I think it is
I
at the
agree.
nucleus of Stilgar here. He
Yeah.
is genuinely funny, but in a way that somehow actually adds to his sincerity.
It
The
complements
atheists
his arc.
around him mock and they tease, yet when he quotes the prophecy or speaks to it, it comes from a deep place of reverence and authenticity. It's anything but a joke to him. And
Yeah.
that duality, it's not only fascinating from a movie perspective, it's a poignant and blistering reminder of the cogent and passionate convictions that often convert those ideologies into war.
Yeah.
Because once the Holy War begins in the final act, Stilgar is such a powerful and important figure alongside Paul. And I think he's just as vital to the film's ideas on religious indoctrination and how messianic followership is realized, even when it seems like a joke to those on the outside. Once Paul took his place, the sneers and snickers vaporized quite abruptly. There were no more laughs to be had, and I love how the film uses humor to convey the dangers of religious ignorance, something that Bardem taps into immaculately in his performance. It's really great. And in a lot of ways the beating heart of the themes once we get to that last act.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think the heightened level of his performance allows the difference of opinion and beliefs between the Freemen themselves to really stand out. Again, it's obvious, like it's clear, and they verbalize it very directly. But it's not common for a movie like this, a big epic blockbuster like this, if you want to call it that. It's not common for it to have moments where characters actually differ in thematic opinion, and it really invite the audience into that conversation a little bit. And I do think this film is willing to at least acknowledge both sides, even if it does kind of take a side by the end. But at least the side it takes is a compelling one to ponder on, because there is a timely nature to it. But I do think Javier Bardem is a great way to sort of bridge that gap in how beliefs are different, even among the same kind of people. Each tribe, if you want to call them that, they don't all believe the same thing here. The Freemen all believe different things, and I love that it's willing to tackle that head on. They debate here.
They
And I
do.
think that's fascinating.
Absolutely, which circles back to Shani, and I do want to talk more about her because I agree with you. Zendaya's performance here is really great, but to add on to what you were saying earlier about religiosity and how Paul becomes involved, and Lady Jessica as well. I want to
True.
talk about
Yeah.
both of them
Yeah.
while using what we just talked about there with Stilgar as context, because that fanaticism is really, really important as it relates to Lady Jessica and Paul in this film. There's this great juxtaposition between part 1 and part 2 as it relates to Lady Jessica and Paul. With Lady Jessica, it's interesting because her love for Paul in the first film is unquestioned. She is convinced that he is the one, but beyond her duties and the being Jesuit, she's a concerned mother who,
Yeah, it's genuine.
yeah, absolutely. However, that quickly changes in this film. But before her turn, there's an incredible parallel between her and Paul and
Yeah.
how both of them, to your point, are actually forcefully converted into these powerful religious figures. Lady Jessica's scheming is nefarious and unsettling, but her role as the Reverend Mother of the Freeman people isn't something she chooses willingly.
No.
She either chooses this role or dies. And I think that context matters as it offers another layer to the film's religious underbelly, especially once Paul and Lady Jessica begin to dismantle the Freeman ethos from within as a way to gain power and influence. It adds so much heft to the idea of religious fanaticism and blind faith because it demonstrates that the Freeman people essentially destroy themselves. Again, it's not subtle, but I do think Denis handles that
Yeah.
extremely well. And it's
Yeah.
kind of terrifying to see how Lady Jessica and Paul gain a stronghold with the Freeman people, manipulating them in an attempt to transform Paul into this Messiah figure. Something
Yeah.
that they do, at least Lady Jessica does at all cost, even if that means turning her son against her.
Yeah.
Obviously, she ends up winning that battle, as Shawnee aptly articulates later on in the film.
Yeah.
But the idea that they were forced into these roles, they didn't necessarily choose it, I think says something about, again, the fanatical faith that's being conveyed here.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I mean, how many times have you maybe been in situations, not you in particular, I'm talking about the royal you, just anyone, where you find yourself in conversation with someone that you know, a friend, a family member, whatever, whether it be about religion or politics, and their goal is to trying to convert you to their belief system, right? That happens a lot, and that's very literally what's happening to Lady Jessica here. In many ways, she's kind of hypnotized. She's kind of possessed, and that's sort of what happens with Paul as well. Like
As a result of Lady Jessica's scheming
Yeah.
and manipulation, but it
Yeah.
begins with her being forced by drinking the blue juice first. Because
Yeah,
if
the
that
water of
doesn't
life, as
happen,
it's called.
the
Yeah.
water of life, if she's not forced to drink it, then there's a very good argument to be made that Paul never makes this transition. He only makes that transition because Lady Jessica becomes convinced further
Yep.
as a result of drinking the water
And-
of life that she forces Paul to move to the south.
It's a perfect form of orchestration because it allows every moment to happen as quote unquote written. According to Stilgar and the Freeman, everything that they believe, or at least he and his believers believe are going to happen, that happens. But it's ironic that it happens because it doesn't truly happen. It's like it's so interesting how a prophecy can be fulfilled by not actually fulfilling it.
Yeah.
Like not in the way that your belief system would lead you
Yeah.
to want, right? I think
Yeah.
that's so interesting.
And I think those ideas where this film does a great job of creating a balance, because if not for Stilgar and those like him in this film, those ideas would have come off as extremely one note and thin. But I think the film does a great job of adding sincerity. Like that sincerity in Stilgar, I think is really important because it renders the religiosity of this film as sincere, as authentic. It's not
Yeah.
nefarious. It's not, they're not forcing them. Of course, he forces Lady Jessica into this role. That is a little nefarious.
Yeah.
But his faith is certainly authentic, and it
Right.
comes from a deep place of reverence
Mm-hmm.
and meaning for him, which is partially why he forces her into this role. It's important for his religion.
That's the thing. It's like his motives aren't like villainous or anything like that. Like it's fanatical to be sure, but like he's not doing this for control or for any like malicious intent. It's just what he truly believes.
Exactly.
It's just that's the irony of it, that he believes something that we are very blatantly told is orchestrated. And so really the only character here, and it's in the trailer, and I wish that this movie was a little bit more, I guess, conservative with its trailers, because I do think it gives away a lot. But there is one line in the trailer that is obviously also in the movie, is Shawnee yelling, "This prophecy is how they enslave us," and
Yeah.
it just proves that she's really the only character here with any perspective. And that's, I think Denis has even said that part 2 is meant to be seen as her movie, and it's moments like that where you kind of realize, yeah, this is transitioning to be her story. And given the final shot of the movie, I think it sort of makes sense that that's the case.
Well, and that's where the Bene Gesserit are really the Darth Vaders of this film, if you will. Like they're the ones that are truly pulling the strings here.
Yeah.
And where Lady Jessica, while she was forcefully converted into this role, she is far from innocent as well.
Right.
She takes advantage of this opportunity to draw Paul in further, which allows for them to gain a stronghold politically and to gain power with everything that we see at the end. So while the religiosity is rendered sincere because of performances like Javier Bardem and how those characters are conveyed here, I truly think that is really important. Otherwise, the religious fanaticism just comes off as silly and goofy and easy to take advantage of. But there needs to be something to ground it to render why they would become vulnerable as a result of that fanaticism, instead of it just being this silly, goofy thing, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I think what adds to that even further are some of the choices that this narrative, or really the original story, makes in choosing which characters are orchestrating what, and who's victim of what, and who's malicious of what. And this is probably more credit to Frank Herbert, I guess accidentally. I don't think he really predicted this, but we now live in a day and age where seeing a bunch of women as really the villains is kind of a provocative thing, right? It especially in a day and age where we want to try and criticize the arc of the white male savior, like the white hero in some ways, and it's done so in a way that's it makes you think, given where we are as a people, right? The current social climate makes us think a little bit differently about those things. And while the film isn't necessarily about that specifically, I think by having these specific, I guess, genders be what they are, it just adds a level of intrigue to this that I get in a different time. I'm not sure if it would have gotten away with it. I just think that is so interesting just to have it that way.
Absolutely. And I think what's also interesting, this is obviously a credit to the novel, but how this film handles it as well, given the depiction of the Bene Gesserit, how they're pulling the strings from the background. And in the foreground, we have this religious fanaticism, as I noted earlier. And again, I love the balancing act of it, because ultimately, given where things go with Paul and Lady Jessica, how they prove themselves to be these powerful figures who are scheming their way to the top, it does render that religiosity as vulnerable, as they destroying themselves from within, so to speak.
Yeah.
So that balance is extremely powerful here. But there's this caveat as well that the novel introduces, and that when Lady Jessica becomes the Reverend Mother of the Freeman, they did not know she was pregnant. That, I think, is really incredible in this film.
Yeah. Especially, yeah, when what they were trying to do goal wise was to keep birthing women because they wanted to keep adding power to the women so that that way one day a male could be born as the all powerful figure. I forget the name that they actually call him, and it ends up being Paul at this point because it was orchestrated to be that way. But yeah, she's pregnant, and I'll just say the person that plays her for a brief moment. I guess that was the surprise here.
Yeah, a little bit of a surprise. I want to say I knew of that beforehand. That had
Well,
been spoiled for me.
I knew that person was in the movie. I didn't know who she was playing.
Yeah,
And when she showed up there, it's like, oh, that's interesting.
that's
Okay,
it.
I can't wait to see her again. And
Yeah.
and kudos to the movie for at least embracing the weird a little bit because from what I remember, Frank Herbert's novel is very hallucinatory. It's a strange beast, which is something I kind of respect David Lynch for at least trying to do in the 80s, even if the movie's not good. It just has a real weirdness to it. And Dune Part 1, the precursor to this one specifically, it was more practical, it was more grounded, which I respected about it, but
Mhm.
Part 2 finally starts to embrace the weird. And I respect a big movie like this for
Mhm.
being a bit peculiar in some of the images it
Yeah.
chooses to give us.
Yeah, I really liked the inclusion of that here.
Mhm.
Now, to reiterate, I noted this when we talked about Dune Part 1 a few years ago. I have not read the novel, but I do know a lot about it
Mhm.
and have read that the way Denis handles that here is actually quite different
Yeah.
than what it is in the novel.
Mhm.
And again, speaks to the art of adaptation and
Yeah.
how cinema can create something new out of something that is familiar.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I can articulate it directly or exactly, but I
Mhm.
did find myself moved by that in this film. It gives
Mhm.
Paul and Lady Jessica this emotional layer that isn't really there otherwise, because
Sure.
throughout a lot of this film, they are always concerned for her safety and well
Mhm.
being, this
Yeah.
unborn child. And it illustrates how powerful the water of life is, thus
Mhm.
amplifying their mystique further and giving religious followers more of a cogency in their faith that I think is really interesting. So it's a brilliant piece of writing and adaptation that adds more context, that adds more layers to the religiosity of this film and why
Yeah.
they would believe them as being the one, even if you and I, as the audience, know that Paul and Lady Jessica are really more manipulating them
Yeah.
because they're thrust into these roles and
Yeah.
they're trying to gain power out of it.
Yeah, yeah, and I do think that's very fascinating. It's been a while since I've read Dune, and to be honest, I remember it being kind of a chore, if I'm being honest. But then again, I was a lot younger. That was a high school read. May have been even before that, honestly, because it feels like a Lord of the Rings type of epic that actually has it has its full glossary. It has its own
Yeah.
index. It's a dense form of mythology, even if it tells a
Mhm.
very compelling story. I will say, watching these two movies and becoming reintroduced to that story, I don't know if I'm tempted to reread that first Dune, but I am tempted to at least read Dune Messiah, which is a much shorter story. But from what I understand, is I I I I I I I know it has its fans. I'll simply say that, and I am curious to see what Denis does if he waits a couple years or if he does it right away. I think they might fast track a few other films first, but you're right that the way that this film handles some of those things, as obvious as it is, it, it's there's something very compelling about it on its face. There really is.
Yep. I really liked it. The dialogue involved there, again, even though we know Lady Jessica, which, again, to be fair, she was thrust into this role,
Yeah.
do it or die. So you do empathize with her a little bit. But when
Yeah.
she's in the role, she begins scheming
Well,
and
well, even so, like to cut you off there, that's happened before. Like we've heard stories of people not being converted to a certain religions back in the day, and they're kind of murdered for it, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. She knew that she had to take on this role.
yeah,
She's a little reserved, but of course she does it and takes advantage of it for all the reasons that we're talking about. And yet, despite how unsettling that is, when she starts having these conversations with her unborn child, there is something, at least for me, and maybe it's just me, I'm willing to admit, but I did find it oddly moving.
yeah,
Even Paul, when he becomes involved in that as well, like they show
yeah,
this care that I think is really compelling. And you couple that with what you're talking about, how the cameo comes in. I think all of that is handled gracefully, and it does, as I noted, it adds a layer to it that otherwise could make those characters maybe a
yeah,
little bit more rigid. At least
yeah,
Lady
yeah,
Jessica.
yeah.
I do think Paul actually has a ton of variance here, because throughout most of this film, he is actively fighting against the prophecy.
And that's the irony of how he falls into it. Then the anger
Yeah,
and resentment kind of makes him more vulnerable to it.
yeah,
I do think Chalamet is very good here. I definitely preferred his
yeah.
performance here over part one, but it's a very different arc in part one. That
The
was really
writing
the
is almost completely different.
it is, yeah. So to say you like one performance better than the other, it's like part one was
Yeah,
just the introduction of the actual arc we get.
yeah,
Um, uh, I still think Chalamet's best performance is probably Little Women, if I'm being honest. But I don't, there's something about the way we see Paul at the end of this movie, Dune Part Two, that's and this is something I liked about it. This might sound like a backhanded compliment, but when he starts to fully embody the traits of the prophecy he kept fighting against, there's almost something kind of whiny and childish about him. But that's something that Chalamet's usually just very good at. And I think depending on the right movie, it can really work. Sometimes it does, sometimes it's I don't know about that. But here it really does. I found it really compelling, honestly.
hmm
There's something so boyish about it,
hmm
and I think here it kind of works in its favor to show that level of manipulation that he fell into and how easy it was for him to fall into it.
yeah.
I think that's really compelling.
I really loved Chalamet here as well. His performance actually might be quite underrated. You know, we talked about
Hmm.
Javier Bardem. He's arguably the MVP. I still want to talk about Zendaya as well. I loved her performance, although maybe to reiterate a notion that was going around on social media over the weekend, and I certainly raised my voice in it as well,
Hmm.
and that the best performance was whoever was on screen at the moment, because I think this entire cast is great. But
Yeah, it's kind of
Chalamet
fair.
Chalamet is really great here. I love how in those opening scenes throughout a lot of the first act, he's still finding his way among the Freeman people. He's very much the same Paul that we saw in part one. Then he begins to actively fight against the prophecy. He wants to become one of the Freeman people
Yeah,
genuinely, and I think he taps into that very well. There's the romanticism angle between him and Shawnee that I think is really great as well. And then yeah, the character starts to become more vulnerable as the
yeah,
stakes
yeah,
begin to amplify themselves, and they are forced to move south. But even beforehand, when they are fighting against the Harkonnen soldiers there on Arrakis,
hmm,
and they're in the midst of these battle sequences, like he carries this um this toughness, this commanding nature that I think
well,
is
there's
actually
something
really great.
there's something passionate about him, like
Yeah.
because I think that's what makes his arc heartbreaking in its own way, because you clearly believe that he is passionate for caring for the Freeman people. He wants to be on their side, and a lot of that is because of his father. You know, that was his father's mission, was to join forces with them and basically create
Yeah.
peace. And you could tell that it's not just his relationship with Chani that's causing it. He genuinely wants to protect these people,
Yeah.
and you do believe that.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's really important. It's very authentic, him wanting to simply live among the Freeman people, And if
Yeah.
he's going to take a leadership role, it's going to be in that regard, not as this supreme ruler, so to speak.
Right.
Not this religious figure, but on a more practical, pragmatic scale.
Right.
And I think he does carry that forcefully in this commanding way that I think
Yeah.
is really great. And then even when he begins to transition, when those vulnerabilities, that anger starts to come out, I think he's able to take his performance to another level, which is why, and again, I think it's indicative of what are people talking about in the discourse in terms of what they responded to the most. And you think about some of the lines of dialogue in this film.
Yeah.
May they knife, chip, and shatter. That's something you certainly hear in the trailer, but when he conveys that in context of the movie, especially, there is this electrifying aura around that line of dialogue. Or when he tells them, Arrakis used to have its Freeman name, and he mentions Dune. Like
Yeah.
it's the
perfect Leo DiCaprio point. Yeah.
thing.
I was literally
But
just going to say that.
It's almost like this chill-inducing moment. Like the way he conveys that dialogue there, it's less comical in the Leo.
Oh, there's something frightening about it. Yeah.
Yes, like he delivers that extremely well. And of course, what everyone is talking about, the silence moment at the end and how he barks that is really great. So I think his performance here is extremely effective.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I want to go back to something I said that I also really liked about it, especially in that final confrontation with the Emperor and the Bene Gesserit. Okay, there is something kind of whiny and boyish about it. Like when he I guess we're in spoilers now, right? We can kind of can we get a bit direct with some of these things, or do we want to?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, when he forces the Emperor to kiss his father's ring, and he kind of stomps his feet like a little boy for a moment. It's like, but like, I kind of love that. Like, I kind of love that because it once again shows how easily manipulated he was. I think it actually adds to the character in a weird way. And any other performer, like another boyish performer like a Tom Holland would not be able to sell that. It would not work. But Chalamet somehow bridges the gap perfectly. And I found myself compelled by that.
I agree. I think there's a great duality. I think part of the reason that works, in addition to how maybe foreboding he's carrying himself in the moment, but it also comes off the heels of this fight he has with the Austin Butler character of Fayed. I'm not sure. I can't remember how to pronounce the character's name.
Fade Rotha. Fade Rotha.
Is
Yeah.
that how you say it? Fade Rotha?
I think it's something like that. Yeah.
So they get into this fight, and we can certainly talk about him and Austin Butler's performance as well. But they get into that fight in which he wins. And it is this intense moment. It's a pivotal moment. And him killing Fade Rotha is significant. That is no small feat.
Yeah.
So, that is anything but boyish, right? So you have that incredible polarity there where maybe the stomping of the feet is a little childish, but it comes off the heels of a moment where it is him at his, showing the most bravado, arguably.
Right. Yeah. And I think that balance is very well handled. And of course, this is why a great ensemble piece like this is so necessary, because a performance sometimes gets better because of another performance that it's feeding off of. And it's not just Austin Butler, but it's how Timothée Chalamet embodies both of those extremes and how reaction shots from Zendaya add different texture to it. There's perfect synergy in performance here. As a performative piece, I think it's very well balanced. So as much as we maybe criticize some of the editing choices from a narrative standpoint, the film is very well edited from a performative standpoint, and being able to like create this synergy between performance and insert shots and character. That's all very well handled, and I think that's what adds to the level of Chalamet's performance working as well as it does.
Well, you invoked the name Zendaya, and I agree with you.
She's good.
The
She's
insert
great.
shots of her in those final moments, I think, are really great. I love her performance because it's actually kind of stoic. There's some
It's an
lines of
eyes
dialogue.
performance. It's an
It is
eyes
an
performance.
eyes performance,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I love the elegance she brings to it.
Yeah.
The quiet nature that we see in the character throughout really most of the film. Now, of course, she has some conversations with Paul throughout the film, but it's all come from this place of graciousness
Yeah.
and also cautiousness, because she knows, like, she understands what she hears. She certainly doesn't believe in any of the religious fanaticism. She mocks and partakes in the snarkiness early on, but when things turn, when it becomes this intense conflict in the back half of the film, she doesn't really talk a whole lot. She
No.
speaks with her actions
Yeah.
and with, again, those mannerisms. The face work here is
Yeah.
is
The
really
eyes,
great.
and
Like,
it's a performance of eyes and gestures, which are
eyes
so
and gestures.
difficult.
That's
Yeah.
absolutely what it is. And honestly, it's like she's writing a thesis with her eyes, and
She is, which
the
is like,
final act of this movie.
I want to go back and, reference something I said earlier, that Javier Bardem might be the standout here, but that doesn't necessarily mean he gives the best performance, if you ask me. He's just, the standout because he is kind of the comic relief, even though the comic relief aspect of his performance does have a heft, like an
It's
emotional
important.
weight to
Yeah,
it.
absolutely.
It is important. But Zendaya's performance is certainly the most challenging because of everything we're talking about there, and that
Yeah.
deserves credit. So might even be her best performance of her career at this point. I mean, I haven't seen Challengers yet. Something tells me that might be the one to look out for.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's how ironic that both Zendaya and then Timothée Chalamet before her are potentially going to give their best performances in a Luca Guadagnino film. And okay, and
Yeah.
I have to correct myself. I did say that Chalamet's best performance of his career might be Little Women. That might be my favorite, but there is something about his performance in Call Me by Your Name.
Call
that
Me by Your
is-
Name. Yeah.
Yeah,
that-
it's hard to ignore
it's
that one.
those two for sure. Those
Yeah,
two
yeah.
for me. No
Yeah.
doubt about it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I love Zendaya here from a film perspective. I know she's done a lot of TV work and is really well regarded for her performance in Euphoria. I have not seen that show though. I assume she's great. Everyone talks about her performance as being excellent there.
Yeah.
On the film side though, and granted, she hasn't done too much. She's done all these big movies because she's a big name and a big star.
Yeah.
So it's the Spider-Man movies, which, that's going to be limiting given that character and the way it's written in the MCU. Space Jam: A New Legacy. Okay. Lola Bunny, love her, but it's again limiting.
Yeah.
So
I don't know if
like,
that counts.
The Greatest Showman is this huge musical. So like this film, like Dune Part 2 is, to this point, even though it's a supporting role, is probably the film that's given her the most work to do. And I think she absolutely comes to play. And I think she's fantastic. And I agree with you. Challengers, she's going to be the lead of that film.
Yeah.
And that will be her first. I guess Malcolm and Marie, she's really great in that. Say what you will about the movie. Her performance is very good.
Yeah, that's fair.
But Challengers will, without question on the film side, be her biggest role to date. So we'll see how that turns out.
It'll challenge this one. It'll challenge this one
yeah,
for sure.
But her performance in Dune Part 2 is
it's really good. Yeah, it's funny that we talk about the eyes because the emphasis on blue eyes here is once again even more emphasized than it was in the first movie. So like the fact that you have that aspect of it and yet she's still able to act around that. It's amazing. Yeah, it just goes to show that even despite the special effect, it's not the special effect doing the work.
No, it is her doing the work.
It is absolutely her, and it is compelling for sure.
Absolutely. Quickly, should we talk about Austin Butler?
Yeah, he's he's a method man, I guess we can say. He's fun. He's fun in this. I mean, I don't mean fun like in a funny way, but yeah, he is. You know how we sometimes talk about how actors love to play villains, and they seem to have such a it's almost like they're having such a ball doing it. Yeah, clearly Austin Butler is having so much fun on set. And but I think that works for his character because that character is meant to be unhinged, and I think he taps into that very well. So he is frightening for the most part, yeah. But like the unhinged nature of him is what I responded to. He was just so magnetic.
Yeah,
So I like that. I did.
absolutely. I think he plays the sociopath very well. Like I think
Mhm.
he's really great. He chews on a lot of scenery in this film.
Oh, he
But
literally chews. It's
yeah, I love the intensity of it though. Like he plays it up. To your point, he's having the
yeah,
time of his
yeah. It's like
life.
he's chewing the air the way his mouth moves.
Yeah. It's exaggerated in all of the best ways.
Oh yeah,
And I love that about the character. And obviously that's partially how it's written as well. Like when we first meet him, it's in this arena and he's playing up to the crowd and they're all cheering him and it's this moment of him having to fight off these drugged
hmm
uh you know former Atreides soldiers.
yeah, yeah.
And I love that whole sequence. Obviously, that's where the film is shot with the infrared camera, so it has this
hmm
black and white cinematography that I love. Certainly adds a visual
Oh
layer to
yeah.
the film that's
There's a lot of visual
compelling.
variation in this one when compared to the first.
Absolutely, and so I love that about the film. And yeah, Austin Butler he plays it up, and even that moment he has with the Leah Seydoux character, I think it's interesting. I know there's jokes to be had. I've certainly seen that in some of the memes over the weekend. It is
hmm
kind of funny how again he taps into this this bravado that is quickly very very quickly
hmm
undermined when she offers him a little bit of skin, shall we
Yeah,
say, and
yeah.
he very much falls into that trap.
I
uh
can't help but feel like the movie itself is kind of aware of the potential laughter it's going to receive in that regard. Like it's
Maybe,
like
yeah,
it just like their dynamic is heightened in such an
yeah, it's
almost
playful.
yeah, it
Yeah,
almost feels like, again, this is going to sound like a very backhanded compliment. It's going to sound like a negative when it's not, but it's almost pornographic in the way it's like
okay.
communicated. It's it's heightened in such a
It is a little
way.
titillating for sure.
Yeah, yeah, it not to say it's like titillating in a sexual way, but it almost feels like, performatively, it just seems so heightened, like it did come from pornography or
Yeah,
something like that.
it
But I
does.
think that's the
Yeah,
point.
yeah. What was that Netflix film that came out last year where there's this heightened back and forth between the couple? Uh,
Fair
fair
play, fair play.
play. Is that
Oh,
like
with Alden Ehrenreich.
yeah, like with how there's like a heightened dynamic that where there's this back and forth and they're trying to like one up each other almost. It
Yeah,
has that kind of
it,
vibe to it a
it,
little
it,
bit.
I guess that is a fair comparison because in a very general sense, it's like the film telling us, yeah, you're not supposed to take this too seriously. Uh,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah, like that's another reason why I actually respected this movie because it does have moments of levity like that, even if it wasn't intentional.
Yeah.
This scene is not
Mhm.
comedic, but it's certainly not heavy. Like
Yeah.
it has a bit of a lightness to it, despite the titillating nature that we're sort of
Yeah.
alluding to as well.
And maybe not laugh out loud funny, but I
Mhm.
do love the editing. Maybe there's a smile to be had, or appreciate the cleverness of that playfulness because she shows him some skin, very much alluding to the fact that she is trying to sexually, allure him.
Mhm.
But we don't really see any of it. There's just a quick cut to
Yeah.
them back with the Emperor where I forget, maybe the Reverend Mother's like, okay, well, we're pregnant now with
Yeah.
his baby, and that was the whole
That was the whole
game here.
point.
That was the
Yeah,
whole
like
point.
like
It's
again,
like
like it's so literal, but
yeah,
somehow there's an amusing nature to it that I
yeah,
was
it
I was
is
like,
a
okay,
little
like
amusing.
I'm kind of with this. I'm kind of with this. Like there actually are a lot of moments of real amusement here in this movie that I really did appreciate. Like you said, there's no real moment of laugh out loud humor.
Mhm.
But the film is amusing at times. Actually, I take that back. There's one moment of laugh out loud humor here, and it's the right one. It's that moment between Stilgar and Josh Brolin's character's name. I'm blanking on his name all of a sudden. Um, Gurney.
Gurney, yeah.
When Gurney takes Stilgar and Paul and Chani to the secret Atreides base where
Yeah.
the weaponry is hidden.
Yeah, the
And it's like
nukes.
the nukes
The
are hidden.
Oppenheimer nukes.
The Oppenheimer nukes. Yep, they're hidden in plain sight. And Stilgar's like, that's like the worst hiding spot. Says that's the whole point. It's that it's
You did you go looking for it?
Did
But
you
he's
go
like,
look at
nope.
it? No, I didn't think to look there. It's
Yeah, no, I love that. Yeah, this film is surprisingly humorous at times. I agree. Even though, as we talked about in our opening thoughts, the film on the whole amplifies the scope comparatively to part one, certainly heightens the stakes as well.
it's a movie. Yeah.
But there is some fun to be had here. And I think that humor comes at the right time. I think it's woven naturally with how these characters would respond to those moments. It doesn't overly linger,
Right.
you know. And when it's playful with Austin Butler, again, I think it's handled in the right ways without it turning the film into a spoof or a completely different movie. Like it still functions within the tone of the entirety of
It's still
of the
Dune.
film.
It's still
It's still
Dune,
Dune.
and not Spoon or something.
Exactly. Like, and that's why, like, Austin Butler's performance, again, to give him some credit, like, it might be exaggerated, he might be chewing on scenery, but he adds menace to the character that is necessary, that counters whatever levity is there. He does offer this daunting nature to the character that kind of weighs it out, like balances it out rather.
Yeah, I'm with you.
That I think is really great. And then maybe the last thing we can talk about, I know we're going long here, but the spectacle of the film. This is obviously a massive movie, very operatic. There are the sandworm sequences in this film, which we haven't really talked about too much, but we get quite a few of them, at least 3 or 4.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, that's a moment here that could have come off as repetitive because we do get them a lot. Like you would think that the movie would want to save them for crucial moments, and it does. But yet every time a major sandworm appears, it's almost like we're seeing it again for the first time. And it's the way that they're composed. It's the way that they're balanced within the frame. It's all these different tricks that are done. The sound is always a little bit different. It's like we're getting different dimensions of them.
Yeah.
So like it's well balanced and varied in that regard.
Yeah. It's big, it's massive. There's depth to the imagery that's great. You know, that the money shot of the film, really, with the 3 worms coming into the battle is admittedly pretty awe-inducing.
Yeah.
I love that moment.
Yeah.
Or the sequence where they're fighting the huge Harkonnen rig in the desert, I think is really great.
Sure.
Love the aerial footage there. Adds so much scope to the moment because you see how big this rig is comparatively to these tiny little bodies that are running around and trying not to get killed. I think is fantastic. Or just, you know, again, that moment of fighting the Harkonnens in the desert and they're using the sand and the desert clouds to their advantage, I think is really great. And the cinematography adds a wonderful layer to that as well.
For sure.
And the ending battle and the parallel, the shot of Chani as the battle begins, which parallels the foreshadowing of Paul seeing himself in that same battle in part 1.
Yeah.
All of that I think is really great. I love how the choreography and how all of that shot adds to this to the operatic massiveness that is this movie.
Yeah, I agree.
Good
movie.
My last thought on here, and I know I mentioned it earlier, but we haven't really talked about it too much, but Hans Zimmer's score, I think, is great here. I loved it.
Yeah, it's I'm gonna be humming that thing for a while.
It's so good. Like, and I like how different it is from the first one. It's not regurgitating the exact same musical cues. There's
not
this
really.
romantic cue that plays throughout a lot of the film that I think is great. I mean, it's a lot of the same tones, but musically, it's actually quite different.
It is,
which I appreciate.
Yeah, it adds a different tone to it. Definitely adds a sense of melancholy to it at the right times because it doesn't undersell the levity of this film. That there is an amusement to it, but when there is a sense of melancholy to it, it certainly works in favor of it. It works where it counts. Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts on Dune Part 2?
I know I posted this on Twitter, so I'll reiterate this again. It's not my favorite Denis Villeneuve film. Of the 10 films I've seen of his, so he's made 11 feature films. The only one I haven't seen is August 32nd on Earth, I think it's called. That was, I think that was his first. No, that may have been his. No, that was his first film. Maelstrom was his second film. I would probably rank Dune Part 2 6th out of 10 of those films I've seen. Which is it's still a very good movie, but I still prefer Sicario, Arrival, Enemy, and admittedly, I am liking Blade Runner 2049 more as time goes on. I think I'm learning to appreciate that film more as an emotional experience as opposed to just being a sequel to Blade Runner. I think when I look at it as its own thing, I'm able to appreciate that film more. So that one's rising the ranks for me as well and sits somewhere in the top 5. But Dune Part 2, it's good. I weirdly think, given where I think this story goes in Dune Messiah, again, I have to read it. I think that has the potential to be the best one. So I do hope he makes it. And I weirdly hope he takes a little bit of time. Let this one kind of simmer and maybe add a bit of a time jump to really recontextualize where the story could potentially go. But I think it could be interesting.
Yeah. I really like this film a lot. As far as a few final thoughts here, real quick. We mentioned Josh Brolin earlier. I just want to reiterate, I really like him here.
Yeah.
I think he has a great dynamic with Chalamet as someone, as Gurney is loyal to Paul, as he was to Paul's father. I love how that is continued here, even when he becomes concerned alongside with Shawnee, understanding the stakes and what's at play. I love that dynamic, how that evolves. Rebecca Ferguson, also fantastic here. Lady Jessica, we talked about the character, but Ferguson I want to call out in her performance.
Yeah, she embraces where that character goes. She's committed, we'll say.
Dave Bautista, I think, is also really fun here as this coward character.
Oh
that
yeah. He's
well.
He just does a lot of screaming and yelling in a very crybaby kind of way.
Yeah, it's totally antithetical to Austin Butler's performance, and it needs to be, right. Those two characters are antithetical.
Yeah, and of course the big one is not the beast one.
Yes,
the physically the bigger one.
That irony.
Yeah.
Some great subversion there. Yes. So Batista is very good there. Christopher Walken and Florence Pugh, I like them. They're underutilized, or I guess to be fair, because I really do like the film, their involvement here is limited, so their performances are as well. But I think they're fine. They're serviceable given how those characters are written.
Oh yeah, they're more MacGuffins than anything else.
Yes,
and from what I understand, there's more to consider with them as the story continues. Although
Pugh, especially Princess,
Pugh, absolutely with Florence Pugh, that there's more to her for sure.
Yeah, she'll be more involved in the next one.
Yeah,
no doubt about it.
But I forget who said this on Twitter. In fact, I think it was a few people that referenced this. Really, the best reason to have Christopher Walken in this movie is just the way he says Baron. Baron.
Yeah, and there was
so I can't take credit for that, but that's whoever said that on Twitter, you're absolutely right.
And I believe Variety put out an article today. I didn't realize that he had taken a 4-year acting hiatus. He came back specifically for this movie, though, because he loves Denis Villeneuve, loved Arrival, loved the first Dune, and just simply wanted to work alongside Denis and this cast. And so he decided to join this movie, which I thought was an interesting little factoid.
That's interesting.
I mean, it's a small, limited performance, but I think he's perfectly adequate given what he's asked to do.
He's fine. It could have been distracting because of how much of a familiar face that he is. And I get somehow he's not like he and Florence Pugh could have easily been like, oh, that should have been played by someone less famous. Like it could have fallen into that trap, but I don't know. I don't think it does. I was never really distracted by that.
Same thing with, and again, spoiler alert if you haven't seen the film, even though we talked about it earlier, Anya Taylor-Joy, a familiar face that has a very brief appearance here, but could be distracting. And I think in context of what that scene is doing, especially given its, I guess, what's the word to describe that? The word is escaping me at the moment, but how ethereal that whole sequence is shot.
Oh, that okay, yeah, yeah.
That whole vision sequence that Paul has when we see Anya Taylor-Joy on screen, like I think all of that is handled brilliantly. So
yeah.
I didn't find it distracting.
Well, I did find it distracting, but in a way that's complementary to the film. Because like by having someone well known play that role for just a brief moment, it's letting you know, oh, this character is going to be more important later on. So like by
It's
having
almost working as foreshadowing.
basically that's exactly what it's doing. So like you can actually use a distraction like that to your story's advantage, and I think this one does, knowing that assuming she's going to come back to play this character again, and knowing where the story goes, that makes a lot of sense. So they're planting those seeds that, oh yeah, we got to remember this character. We got to seeing this now that we have to wait a few years for Doom Messiah, whenever that does come out. We know we have to remember this character because it's played by that person.
Yeah.
So I like that's when it's utilized well.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think all of that is handled great. I love the performances, love the scope and scale to this film, as I mentioned earlier. Just as an auditory and visual perspective, it is incredibly immersive and transportive. I could eat up the cinematics of this film all day. Absolutely love it in that regard. And from a storytelling perspective, I do love where this film begins and where it ends. I think more than anything, especially given the spectacle of this, although Lawrence of Arabia is very apt as well.
Yeah.
But I do think that these two films are very much akin to Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers.
Okay.
That to me is the most appropriate, even more so than Star Wars. I understand the Star Wars allusions and the comparisons there.
Yeah.
But in terms of the overall arcs, obviously the details are all different, but the overall beginning to end and where one leaves off, I think is very similar. Fellowship, it does conclude on the right note, but it also ends on a beat where you know that this is far from the end. We have so much more story to go. And I think similarly, Dune Part 1 ends in that way. And then you get to Two Towers where it picks off almost immediately where Fellowship left off. There's this huge battle and it lingers to, oh my God, we're transitioning to something where the stakes are now at their highest we've seen yet.
Yeah.
And that's exactly how this film ends. There's a huge battle, transitions to, oh my God, the story's about to get insane, like where the Two Towers ends, which is why I can't wait to to get to Messiah, get to our Return of the King, so to speak.
What will they call Doom Messiah if it gets made? Will they call it Doom Messiah, or will it be
Dune
called
Return
Dune Part
of
3?
the King. That's what I would do.
Well, I mean, this movie lost an opportunity by not calling it Tune, so we could call that one Throon.
The Dune with the two, as you're talking about towers, Dune Two Towers.
Yeah, or make the E in Dune look like the number 3, so it's like Done 3.
Done. Okay, that's probably what they'll do.
Probably what they do. Now, in seriousness, I do wonder if they'll call it Doom Messiah or if they'll call it Doom Part 3. I think it gets back to our first question opening up this conversation. Will Warner Brothers and Denis, will they wait a long stretch of time to let that time jump linger? I think if they do that, it will be called Doom Messiah. But I think if this is fast-tracked a bit more and that time jump is not as deliberately captured here, I wouldn't be surprised if they just call it Doom Part 3 to keep the consistency going. So I don't know, but I think whatever direction they go might dictate the title direction.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. Whatever they decide to do, consider me very much on board. I love this film. I love the first Dune. I mentioned earlier, it's still not my favorite Denis. That goes to Arrival.
Yeah, I was going to ask how you rank this one of the films you've seen of his.
Well, and it's interesting. I think it speaks to just how much I love these films, because Arrival, as we've talked about, I think is one of the best sci-fi movies of the 21st century. Love that movie. I love Sicario. That's probably my number 2. And as much as I love the Dune movies, I think Blade Runner 2049 is Pretty good. Pretty good. I think it's, and I know this is going to sound blasphemous, but I think it's about as good as the first one.
Yeah,
Like,
I wouldn't
think
go that
it's-
far,
it
but
is-
I am
think it's
learning.
that good.
I mean, I think it is one of Denis' better films, and I would take
Mhm.
Blade Runner 2049 over Dune's Part 1 and 2 personally.
I
But
think it is immaculately complimentary to that original Blade Runner.
that's fair. Yeah.
I think like the way it completely flips the coin. I don't know if Denis could have handled that any better. There's
Probably not.
one element, the Jared Leto part is a little wonky, admittedly. That's
Yeah.
the only part that I'm still grappling with. But that's a small sliver. That's a larger
There's-
storytelling thing.
There's
I'm
that,
not-
and like the whole replicant rebellion scene with Mackenzie Davis, that kind of like feels like sequel setup a little bit like that. I could have done without that as well, but those are, I mean, the movie's nearly 3 hours long.
Yeah,
so that's
I don't mind that at all, especially given the context leading up to that. But
Okay.
the way Denis examines the whole replicant thing from a very different angle, a more direct angle, I guess, but imbued with this emotion that isn't in the original Blade Runner, I think is great. It's so good.
Yeah.
Visually and appetite as well.
Oh yeah.
just
duh.
it's
Yeah.
so good. But so that is to say, the Dune movies, and honestly, I kind of find myself looking at these the same way we've talked about Lord of the Rings as one large movie. These two movies are one large movie. So
Yeah,
I don't know if I can separate them.
It's
Um,
it's a 5.5 hour epic.
It really is. And so like if I was going to combine them, I guess I would put them at number 4, like right behind Blade Runner right now. But that could
Okay.
change the more I wrestle with this. I mean, obviously it just came out, the second part that is.
I still love Enemies so much. That's my number 3 right now.
That's probably my number 5.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, good stuff.
Good
He makes
stuff.
good movies. I like
He's
Denis.
pretty good. He's pretty good.
Pretty good at his job. That is to say, if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, we would love to hear from you. You can leave a comment below. If you're watching on Twitter, you can always hit us up on Twitter. If you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment below. You can always hit us up on Twitter, Facebook, where else? Instagram, Letterboxd, all of that fun stuff. You can email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com. And yeah, I think that's it. If you're watching us on YouTube, please like the channel, like the video, all that fun stuff. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please rate and review us there. It really helps out the show. Brendan, anything else before we get out of here?
No, I just have to say, every time I hear the word sandworms, I just can't help but think of Beetlejuice of all things.
Oh,
Remember the way
man.
sandworms?
Okay.
You hate them, right? I hate them myself.
I did not think of that. I equate it to the stupid popcorn bucket.
I mean, now it is. Now that's what it is.
Man, what a marketing gimmick that ended up being.
Again, like if that's the reason this movie does so well, I mean, who cares? It's going to do
Kudos.
well now.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But yeah, this film has already crossed $100 million at the box office domestically. So it's on its way.
Pretty,
well
it's
on
pretty
its
darn
way.
good. I think it's going to do well again this coming weekend.
It's going to Dune well this weekend. I agree.
Har, har, har.
I think that's the memo for us to get out of here. So
Yeah,
thanks
we're
for
done.
watching. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh, Dune!
Dune.
Oh, man.
Dune.
Makes good movies.
Dune.
Love Dune.